People always imagine betrayal as a moment, a clear scene burned into memory. But mine came folded in a plain white envelope that looked no different from the usual notices. I didn't tear it open with suspicion. I wasn't braced for war. I just slid a finger under the flap and read the lines that told me my own son had sold the house I had lived in for decades. My name was there, but it wasn't written by my hand. The signature was crooked, heavy, not mine, and yet on paper it claimed to be me, agreeing to part with the only place that had survived deaths, births, and storms. The house wasn't just walls and bricks. It was my father's sweat in the beams, my mother's hands on the curtains, my late wife's laughter in the kitchen. And now, according to the state, it belonged to someone else. And the one who had made it happen was the boy I had raised, the man I had once trusted to carry forward what was ours. My chest didn't burn with sudden anger. It sank with a weight that told me life as I knew it had been split open. I went to him without calling first because words over a phone would have been wasted. When he opened the door, he didn't even look nervous. He was dressed sharp, the kind of clothes bought with quick money, his hair styled as if image was all that mattered, and in his smile I saw it. He thought he had won. He said, "I knew you'd find out eventually, Dad, but it's not what you think." That line, "not what you think," is what liars say when they don't even bother hiding the truth. I asked him straight, "Did you forge my name?" He didn't answer immediately. He poured himself a drink instead, the glass clinking, as if I were a guest in his house and not the father whose blood had given him life. When he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than the letter. He said, "You're old. You don't know what property is worth now. I couldn't let you waste it. I made a deal. I set us up." But there was no us in what he had done. He had signed away history, stolen my right to decide, treated me as a relic to be brushed aside. In that instant, I realized he wasn't my son in the sense I had believed. He was a man who saw me as an obstacle, and obstacles are removed. I didn't shout. Shouting would have given him satisfaction, proof that he had power. I just nodded, looked around his new apartment that reeked of borrowed wealth, and I told him quietly, "If you think you've erased me, you don't know me at all." He laughed because arrogance always laughs at warnings. But I walked out of there with something stronger than rage. I walked out with resolve. He thought the game was over, that the house was gone, that my silence would be forced. What he didn't understand was that his life was now mine to dismantle piece by piece, and I would not stop until he knew what it meant to lose everything. I moved through the next days like someone learning a language everyone thought he already knew. I read the small print, followed signatures, traced transfers, and listened for the cracks people made when they spoke too much. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I collected. The county clerk's office gave me a copy of the deed and the notary's log. The notary had a stamp date that didn't match the handwriting on the paper and a phone number that led to a VOIT account tied to a rented mailbox. The buyer's name was real enough, a young couple with hopeful plans, but the trail behind them ended in shell companies and a realtor who liked convenience more than questions. I made calls I used to hate making. Lawyers, old friends who ran title firms, a man at the county who once dug wells with me and now tipped me about people who cut corners. Every small lead folded into the next until a pattern emerged. My son had not sold the house to free us from debt or to save us from mismanagement. He had signed it away to cover debts he'd hidden, gambling lines, quick loans that breed violence in the margins. He'd used my name because my credit was cleaner, because a forged signature would slide through a system that trusts names and paper more than it trusts people. When I read the transcripts of his calls to the so-called investors, he sounded like someone practicing phrases written on someone else's script. Confidence where there should be shame. That made me angrier in a different way. He hadn't only betrayed me, he'd sold his life story to people who measure worth in how fast they can turn pain into profit. I could have gone straight to the police with the forgeries and the documents and watched him disappear into a cell where time is a slow and hungry thing. But I wanted him awake for the full sentence. I wanted the kind of punishment that doesn't come with bars and 3 daily meals. I wanted the kind that strips a man's illusions until all that's left are the facts he must live with. So I did something surgical. I began to dismantle the scaffolding he had leaned on. First, I contacted the buyer and told them everything I had found, showed them copies of the deed, the mismatched notary stamp, screenshots of transfers. They were stunned, then furious. They'd sunk their savings into renovations, and the idea that their dream could vanish felt like a theft. I watched their faces when I suggested they place their own contingency on the purchase and call their lawyer. That small act of truth froze momentum. Next, I went to the title company and asked for a full audit. The lead closer I knew from years ago pulled records until lines of code and account names revealed a web that smelled like haste and greed. We put a hold on the sale. He called then, the voice sharp, betraying panic on their bravado. He said I was selfish, that I was trying to ruin him, and the word ruin slid around in the air like a challenge. I told him calmly that he had already ruined himself. Then I made a choice that hurt because it was deliberate. I began to take the thing he prized most, his public face, and show its rot. I reached out to people he'd bragged to, colleagues who had signed off on business ventures, contacts who had lent him money on promises. Some of them believed him, others had smelled trouble for a while and thanked me for connecting the dots. News moves fastest when it carries paperwork, so I handed evidence to a reporter I knew, someone who had a taste for small domestic scandals dressed up as morality plays. The story wasn't a headline at first. It was an article in a local paper, precise and unembellished, with scanned copies of the deed and the notary log attached. That article did the thing the law takes months to do. It turned whispers into names and made people uncomfortable about anyone associated with him. Clients who had been casually generous with contracts began to ask for references. His boss, who had admired his charm, called HR and asked for a review. Suddenly, the promotions he expected were stalled, meetings with investors were postponed, and people who had once laughed at his shortcuts decided to keep their distance. Pride, I learned, is a fragile currency when credit disappears. I watched him flail. He first tried to paint me as an embittered father, then as a man with old grudges, and finally as someone he could bully into silence. Those tactics failed because the truth had weight now, and weight makes lies sink. Meanwhile, I had placed small legal anchors, pendency filings, a quiet notice to the lender, a paper trail that any future buyer would see and think twice about. I knew debtors and sharks move by smell. When they sensed the house would not transfer cleanly, their interest shifted from cunning to fear. Men who collect money by night prefer certainty, and uncertainty costs them patience. They began to call him directly, and he began to be seen in places where men with short tempers meet. I had the investigator track those nights and the names of those who smoked at the edges. I didn't gloat when one of those men turned up in a bar fight and later in a police report. I noted the pattern. Everything was methodical because rage without method is just noise. Days became a spool and I pulled it tight until his fabric began to unravel. I moved carefully because when you dismantle a man who lives on lies, you don't do it with fire. You do it with cold hands. The paper trail I had built was enough to expose him, but exposure alone wouldn't cut him deep enough. He thrived on appearances, on people believing his confidence, so I chose to strike at the places where his face was currency. I visited old neighbors and business partners he still bragged about, not to accuse, but to ask questions in a way that let them see cracks themselves. A single copy of the forged deed laid on the table in silence was more powerful than any speech I could have made. I watched their eyes narrow, their posture change, the respect they had for him melting into suspicion. Word spread in whispers, and whispers are deadlier than shouts because they can't be traced. He tried to call me, tried to demand I stop poisoning his life, but I let the phone ring. Silence is sharper than argument. Meanwhile, I placed quiet barriers in his path. I filed small motions with the county, each one a pebble that slowed the river of his scam. Title holds, fraud alerts, pending investigations that froze accounts he thought he could slip through. He began to stumble in places he once walked smoothly. I knew it because I heard from one of his lenders, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, who asked me if my son was still good for it. That question told me the shark smelled blood. I told him plainly that if he wanted his money back, he'd better tighten the leash because my son's deals were collapsing. He thanked me in that dry way men do when they're already thinking about how to collect. By then, my son had started scrambling. He tried to secure new contracts, but each time he showed up with his wide smile, someone had already heard something. A rumor here, a document there. He blamed me in his anger, said I was ruining his future, but he never said why he deserved to keep it clean. One night he came to my door, eyes wild, and asked if I could undo the mess before it was too late. I looked at him and saw not a son, but a man who thought betrayal could be erased with pleading. I told him he had signed away my right to my help when he signed my name on that paper. He left with curses spilling out of his mouth, but curses don't change facts. By the time the week was over, the house sale had stalled, the buyers were furious, the title company was crawling over every line, and his lenders were circling. It was the perfect storm. His lies were exposed just enough to collapse trust, but not enough to land him in prison yet. That limbo was what I wanted. I wanted him walking free, but with no footing, watching every door close one by one. Because when a man loses the illusion of safety, that's when he feels true punishment. He believed the worst was behind him because he'd watched the sale stall and thought that fear would be enough to stop me. But fear is a thin coat when the real damage is structural. I moved from visible pressure to the quiet work that burns a man from the inside. I attacked his networks, the small seams that had held up his pretend life. I started by visiting people he trusted, the contractor who supplied him cheap materials, the accountant who signed off on his QuickBooks, the landlord who rented him space for business meetings. I didn't complain. I asked questions and left copies of documents where they would do the most harm. On a receptionist's desk, in an accountant's inbox, slipped under a contractor's clipboard. People who make their living on appearances unravel quickly when the paper trail stares them in the face. Contracts were rescinded, deposits returned, and a few too many casual partners decided their reputations were worth more than loyalties. He called, raw with panic, and this time his threats were sharper, the kind that come from a man who sees his options narrowing. He tried to file countersuits, hired lawyers with loud mouths and small track records, and spent the little cash he had on bluster. I let him spend it. Money spent on sound is money not used to repair. Meanwhile, I focused on the places that cut deeper than money, his pride and his future. I reached out to his old mentor at the firm where he'd once promised he'd make a career, and walked into a meeting with names and dates and a copy of the deed. I watched the mentor's face change from curiosity to disgust in a way that taught me what influence looks like when it turns away. References were withdrawn, a promised partnership evaporated. He had built his image on borrowed credibility. I pulled that borrowing list out into daylight and let creditors and colleagues decide. I arranged a confrontation that wasn't dramatic on paper, but devastating in consequence. A community hearing where people he had wronged could speak. I didn't make it a spectacle. I ensured it was orderly, recorded, and attended by people who mattered. Bank officers, small business owners, a reporter with a reach beyond our town. He showed up thinking he could apologize and do damage control. He left with his claims recorded and quoted, his lies echoed back to him by the people who had trusted the shiny version of him and lost money for it. Shame is surgical. It slices confidence away in ways fines and filings never do. That same week, I discovered a ledger he had kept, a sloppy notebook where he wrote names he owed favors to, amounts he'd promised, and dates he'd planned to pay. It was the kind of thing a man keeps to remind himself he's still in control. I photographed it and sent the images to a handful of those names with a single line, "You might want your copy." The replies were instant and brutal. Friends who had pretended ignorance now sought distance, and a few reached out angrily demanding restitution. The weeks turned into a rhythm of ruin for him. Calls from collections, canceled contracts, the slow evaporation of casual friends. He tried to rebuild by selling off anything that still had value, but I had already quieted buyers with a soft warning about entangled titles and pending investigations. He had to find new markets, strangers who didn't check papers, and that's where he made worse deals. Harder men, faster money, deals that came with voices at 2 in the morning, and visits that left marks on his confidence. I never sent those men after him. They found him because he kept the wrong company. But I watched the pattern form and cataloged each misstep. There was a night he came to my doorstep, eyes red and swollen, hands shaking, and for a moment I saw the boy who used to hide in the attic when guests fought. He asked for a loan, some final mercy to clear a deadline, and I let him hold the silence until he could name the amount. When he did, I told him no, flat and precise. He screamed, the sound raw and animal, and I let it be a sound he remembered. That scream didn't change the legalities, but it shifted him. After that night, he didn't call to threaten, he called to plan. He stood in lines at shelters handing out meals. He worked shifts the early birds hate, and he wrote checks he could barely afford. The change was ugly and slow. Revenge had become something I directed toward reformation, nonviolent, procedural, humiliating in the way that makes a man rethink his appetite for shortcuts. Still, there were surprises. I hadn't expected that people who lost money would come to me looking for restitution in ways that wanted more than cash. They wanted stories named, accountability that carried faces. They wanted to stand in public and tell him what his arrogance had done. I arranged small meetings in community centers where the ledger of his failures was read aloud, and where he had to stand and answer. He did so with his chin down, voice thin, making promises into the air like a man trying to patch a dam with his hands. Those moments were the slow erosion. Dignity left him in the little ways. Missed greetings, invitations withheld, eyes that once slid over his flashy shirts now tracking him like a measure of what not to trust. He began to sleep badly, not from fear of jail, but from the knowledge that every door he once used would no longer open. I watched the man who thought he could erase me become someone who had to rebuild his name at street level, one honest hour at a time. Each day he showed up to do the work, and each day a little of his arrogance fell off like old paint. I don't pretend cruelty cured anything, and I don't write this as if I take pleasure in his decay. What I did was necessary in my calculation. I removed safety nets until he was forced to learn the only lesson that sticks: how to be accountable when no one is watching. The house remained in the background of all this, a wound stitched but not healed, a place I could walk through because I had fought for it, and because letting it go would have meant letting go of more than timber. He would pass it sometimes from the street, and his jaw clenched each time. That sight was a kind of daily punishment I never needed to orchestrate. The story continued, and I tightened my hands on the threads until the fabric of his new life began to tear at the seams he had sewn himself. He started losing things that felt invisible until they were gone. Invites, casual favors, the presumption that someone would always answer his call. The ledger he carried like a Bible filled faster with obligations than payments, and the men who once winked at his schemes now kept their distance because distance is cheaper than scandal. Small humiliations accumulated into a rhythm that rewired him. Landlords refused his applications, contractors asked for cash up front, and clients who once brushed off missed deadlines began to demand proofs and receipts. I watched from the edges, not because I was curious about his ruin, but because I wanted to measure whether he would collapse inward or use the pressure to reshape himself. At first, he collapsed. He took bad jobs that eroded more than money, work that ate his evenings, left his back sore, and stole the vanity that had been his shield. He started arriving at community shifts with the kinds of cuts and bruises that come from being untrained at honest labor, and with the red-eyed look of someone who counts hours and plans where to steal a few more. The lone men circled like dogs. One of them suggested he sell things that weren't his to sell, and when he balked, they sent a warning that arrived folded in his mailbox like a reminder that violence lives where paperwork stops. He called me then, voice flat, asking if I had any way to keep the men from knocking on his door. I told him no. Protection makes men soft. Scraping for survival makes them hard. That answer changed him, because it forced him to choose whether he wanted rescue or repair. He chose repair, clumsily at first. He spent days repainting porches and nights folding shirts at a laundromat, and the ledger got thicker with signed receipts and stamped forms. Some people noticed and offered small kindnesses. Others watched his progress with a look that measured whether he was worthy of a loan or a second chance. Those looks stung more than any shouted insult. But revenge hadn't finished its work. I pulled another string he hadn't seen coming. I turned his little empire of favors into testimony. Men who had once pretended ignorance were suddenly interested in making their names clean. I offered them two choices: help him by demanding restitution, or risk being named in records that could tie him to his schemes. They chose their freedom. Testimonies arrived that linked him to false invoices and misdirected deposits. Bank fraud investigators found irregular patterns they'd missed because his operations had always seemed too small to trigger alarms. Those small admissions stacked like legal bricks, and when they met the draft of a civil suit, the pressure changed shape. He had built a life on quick wins and borrowed credibility. As that scaffold came down, he learned what it is to watch your future be itemized into obligations. The men who had once offered him protection turned mute. One of them even testified in mediation. His voice flat, as if admitting he'd been part of the play, made him lighter. The mediation room was an oven of accusation, where victims laid out losses and he sat with the weight of each name. He had to look at people he'd invited into traps and say aloud what he would do about it. Promises sounded small there. Letters with signatures mattered more. After mediation, he tried to run, applied for jobs in other cities, rented a car, packed a bag, only to find every application hit a wall when background checks returned court records and articles. The world had a memory now, and it remembered him poorly. He lashed out once, in the only way he knew, by attacking my reputation on social media with accusations about my past that were small fabrications built on grudges. The posts flared for a day and died because people prefer facts they can verify, and my evidence was clean. Watching him try to weaponize lies made me recognize a final truth. The worst consequence I could hand him wasn't the legal stitches or public shame, it was stripping him of the version of himself that thought he could charm his way out of messes. So I insisted on the last measure that would make the lesson permanent. He had to sign a public confession, a written acknowledgement of wrongdoing that would be filed with the court and visible to anyone who looked him up in the future. He resisted at first, then agreed because the alternative was not just continued pressure, but the slow attrition of his options until nothing remained but survival by any cheap means. The confession was ugly to watch. His name in ink where pride used to be, details he read aloud that made his throat tighten, and signatures from people he had hurt who accepted the formality as a kind of closure. Filing it changed him more than any jail time could have. Prison gives you structure, but confession gives you a record you must live inside. After that, he did not become a new man overnight. He was still defensive, still impatient, still prone to relapse into old thinking when tired, but the ledger had new entries: hours worked at half pay, check marks beside restitution payments, copies of counseling appointments he had attended once reluctantly, and then with increasing frequency. I observed all this like a surgeon checking stitches. There were moments I wanted to step in, to write him a check and smooth the history with money, but every time I pictured the old boy in front of his childhood swing set, trading our story for a paltry sum, and I held back. The most brutal part of my revenge had been refusing to be his safety net. Now the most redemptive part was watching him make choices without asking for rescue. That didn't mean reconciliation was near. It meant he had learned a cost that would follow him for life, a price paid in labor and watermarked paper and a public record of failure. He sometimes caught my eye across rooms at community centers or hearings, and his face would go blank with a question he never asked aloud. "Do you see me now?" I saw him, but I didn't soften. Seeing is not absolution. The last months of that year were a grind that wore into him, and when he left a small envelope on my porch with a single line, "I am fixing this the only honest way I know," I folded it into my pocket and kept walking. Evidence, not words, had become his currency, and that was the only thing I had ever wanted him to learn. The end didn't arrive with fanfare or a single explosion of justice. It came like water carving rock, steady and permanent. The court accepted his confession, and the settlement schedule was etched into official record, his name fixed beside numbers that would take years to balance. The buyers kept the house, but I remained in it because the fraud had rendered the sale null and void, and for the first time in months, I felt the floor beneath my feet belonged to me again. He never came back to that house, not even to collect the last box of his things I had packed and left on the porch until rain soaked the cardboard into collapse. I learned that silence can be sharper than any sentence. It was silence that followed him into every interview, every date, every attempt to start over, because people now carried in their pockets a permanent reminder of what he had done. My revenge was complete, but it didn't taste like celebration. It was a slow burn satisfaction, the kind that doesn't cheer but exhales. I hadn't destroyed him with fists or weapons. I had dismantled his illusions, and that made the lesson heavier. He was no longer the son who thought charm and forged signatures could bend the world. He was a man branded by the truth he had written himself. That brand would not fade. For me, the victory wasn't about the house or the records. It was about balance restored. He had tried to strip me of my history, the place where every board carried memories, and in return, I stripped him of his shield of deception. I went back to the rhythms I had before, the garden, the neighbors who waved with cautious kindness, the creak of the old floor that reminded me the house was alive with me still inside it. Sometimes, when the wind carried sounds from downtown, I wondered if he was working another late shift, if his hands were raw, if the shame had settled into something heavier than anger. I didn't pity him. Pity is wasted on men who chose the path he chose. But I did acknowledge something colder. My revenge had left him no room for shortcuts. Every meal he ate, every roof he slept under, every coin he touched from then on would be filtered through the lesson I had forced into him. He had sold our family home without a thought for what it meant, and I had given him back something far less forgiving, the truth that some debts are not counted in dollars, but in dignity, and once lost, that kind of wealth is almost impossible to earn back. That was the ending I crafted, not a neat bow or a courtroom cheer, but a scar that followed him everywhere, and a house that still stood, holding my life inside its walls.